If your child is trying hard, seems capable, but just isn't moving forward in reading or writing the way you expected, then this video is for you. Because very often what looks like failure on the surface is actually learning happening more quietly, more slowly, and in a different way. I'm Nikki from Dyslexia Unpuzzled here in Hawke's Bay, and I work with people of all ages who've been told they're behind or not progressing or need more practice, even though effort clearly isn't the issue. One of the biggest misunderstandings I see is this: pace gets mistaken for ability. Parents often say things like, they understand it when I explain it to them, but then it just doesn't seem to stick in their minds. They can talk about their ideas brilliantly, but when they try to write them down, it's really hard. They've done this a million times before. Why does it feel like we're going over it again? And that's usually when the worry creeps in, because other children seem to be moving ahead and your child isn't matching that pace. So here's the important thing to remember. Some learners are what's often described as slow burners. Their learning doesn't show up quickly or neatly. It builds gradually and often underneath the surface before it ever becomes visible. However, our education systems are built around timelines, levels, and comparisons. So when a learner doesn't move at the expected speed, the assumption becomes there's a problem. That's where confidence begins to erode. Welby Ings has written powerfully about this experience in his book, Invisible Intelligence. As a child, he learned to read and write at a very different pace from his peers, not because he lacked intelligence or language, but because he processed learning differently. While other children were described as fluent and advanced, he was described as poor. And this wasn't because of what he understood, but because of how quickly he progressed. Over time, that difference became something to hide and feel embarrassed about. That's what happens when pace is treated as a flaw. So if I can just give you an example here. So I recently worked with a 15-year-old. She's really bright, quick-witted, and deeply curious about the world. However, reading for her was just exhausted. She described the words as moving around on the page, and she was constantly losing her place. So I showed her how to use a blank piece of paper to track the lines, which helped, but the concentration required for her to read still drained her completely. She would get halfway through a passage and realise she'd been so focused on figuring out the words that she'd completely forgotten what it was that she was reading or what it was about. So when the questions came either orally or she had to write a response, she felt completely lost. So over time, she began to just switch off from this task. She'd draw in the margins or avoid or ask her friends or just completely withdraw. And this wasn't because she wasn't intelligent, but because the effort she was putting in was invisible to everyone else around her. You might recognise some of these patterns. Panic when asked to read aloud, avoiding writing tasks, not volunteering answers even when the understanding is there, not because the learners aren't thinking, but because repeated misunderstanding teaches them to doubt themselves. What often gets missed is, for some learners, reading is not an automatic thing. It takes intense, exhausting and concentration just to make sense of the words on the page. So while all that energy is being used to figure out words, there's very little left for comprehension or memory or response. So that's why a child can read a page and not remember what it said. That's why instructions, especially long instructions or multi-step instructions, don't stick in the brain. And it's not that they weren't listening. It's because their working memory was already overloaded. It's not about effort or attention. It's about how that information is being delivered and how the brain is processing it. Because that effort is invisible, what gets noticed instead is the outcome, the blank page, the forgotten instruction, the incomplete task, and that gets misread. What's really happening when learning seems slow is this. Learning builds through experience. Each revisit strengthens the neural pathway a little more. If a learner needs to return to something, it doesn't mean that learning hasn't happened. It means the neural pathway is still forming. Revisiting is not a failure, it's construction. Our brains need more time, more repetition, and different entry points for that learning to settle. And that's what strengthens the neural pathways in our brain and allows our learning to stick. When a learner already feels behind, pressure doesn't speed things up, it tightens everything. Confidence drops, avoidance increases, learning becomes associated with stress instead of curiosity. That's why more practice alone really changes the picture. Understanding does. If this is sounding familiar, there's something important that I want you to hear. This is never about effort or motivation, and it isn't about someone needing to try harder. What's usually happening is a mismatch between how learning is unfolding and how it's being measured. When pace becomes the benchmark, learners who process differently start to question themselves, even when they are trying and thinking deeply. That doubt does far more damage than difficulty ever will. When learning is understood properly, everything shifts. The focus moves from what's wrong to how does this learner actually process information? That's where confidence starts to rebuild again. If reading has become heavy or hard at home, there's tears, avoidance, or that familiar tension whenever homework appears. So I've created a free guide called Discover the Secrets to Stress-Free Reading. It's designed for parents who know their child is capable but want clarity about what genuinely helps. I'm going to pop the link below this. So learning doesn't always look impressive while it's forming. Sometimes it looks slow, sometimes it looks messy, sometimes it just looks invisible. That doesn't mean it isn't happening. Thanks so much for listening today. If you would like more conversations like this, grounded in how learning really works, feel free to subscribe to my channel. See you next time.